Welcome to the Gold Factor podcast, where we discuss everything related to unlocking your greatness. We love bringing you topics and stories of ordinary humans creating extraordinary experiences in life. And today, I'm so excited to speak with Dr. Robert Hernandez, a leadership development expert. And he's the president of Influens, helping companies identify and develop emerging leaders. His specialization is in EQ, and he's the author of a brand new book, which is what we're going to talk about today: Masculine Revolution, a journey to reclaim your masculine essence through the power of archetypes. Now, Robert is not just someone I met off the street. Someone I've known now for a couple of years. So welcome, Robert. How are you?
I'm doing well, Bernadette. I'm really excited to get to finally do this. We've been planning this for a little bit, so I'm
I know.
excited.
Been a couple hiccups with scheduling and whatnot, but here we are. I'd love
Yes.
to hear, before we get into the book, which I want to dive into, because I'm so excited you finally released it. But I want to hear about how you got into this work that you do. You specialize in EQ and you take that into corporate and all of those things. But what drove you there? I always want to know the personal side.
It's interesting with the company side, working with Influence, my company, as like you said, we deal with developing emerging leaders. Actually, that started in about 2005. I was invited to a social gathering to meet the then owner. He's retired since then. I purchased the company in 2018. But I was invited to meet him actually on a social basis. A friend of mine at the time, who was also a fellow psychologist, she invited me to a party in Fort Lauderdale to meet the owner then of Influence. And it was, I didn't know it at the time, but it was really for social reasons. She was introducing me, and things, basically took a different turn. The owner was auditioning for people to join his company as a facilitator. And there was already one psychologist on the team. And so he invited me to audition a couple weeks later, and I did. And then I ended up joining Influence at the time. So this is about 2005. I started working with them 2006 alongside my private practice. And in 2018, he basically offered for me to purchase the company. He wanted to retire. And so I said yes. I was really delighted. And in 2018, I took over as the president of Influence. And that's kind of that part of the journey.
Right. What drove you to be a psychologist, though, and tackle these topics? Because you tackle masculinity, you tackle femininity, and you tackle EQ, emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and what walked me down this path to being a psychologist, I have a theology training. That's my first, what I call foundation. And I took a trip over to Australia after I finished my bachelor's. I had a double major, psychology and theology, and I went, the other side of the world to Perth, Australia. I was a teacher at their high school and their counselor, the high school counselor. So no one in this whole school was trained in psychology. I had a major and it was a bachelor's degree, so not much training, but I had more than anyone else there. And so I became the high school counselor for the secondary school students. And the biggest issue they were dealing with at the time in Perth, Australia, was that they were making cannabis brownies. And so I was called in to deal with this major substance abuse issue of these cannabis brownies. And I had no idea what that was because, I mean, back then I was also young, very young myself, and had very little experience in the world. And so I just basically befriended all of these students, and I really believed in them and I wanted them to kind of grow beyond what they were doing. And so I would listen to their dreams and listen to what they wanted to be when they grew up. And in Australia at the time, you were kind of locked in with the education system. So if you didn't have certain grades, you were just not going to go to university. And they would then start to tell you to do other things. But that wasn't the way that I worked. And I guess coming from the States, we think a little bit differently. So I really believed in these kids at the time, and I would say to them, "What do you want to do? What are your dreams?" And they would tell me, and then I would say, "Well, let's figure out a way to get there." And so let's beat the system. And that's what I really did. I got in trouble for doing that because I wasn't doing what all the other teachers were doing. But in the end, a couple of the students changed and they were able to get into university when originally they didn't have the grades to. So I think back then I thought to myself, okay, I want to do something more practical than theology. And so that opened the doors for me to go into psychology. And so when I came back to the States, I enrolled at Columbia University at the time in New York and started my master's there and then finished my doctorate in Miami. And so basically, it was a way to be a little more practical, if you will, from theology. But I always believe that my first foundation is theology. I'm very spiritual. And so that's what actually led me down to study Carl Jung, which was one of the founding fathers of psychology and was very spiritual himself. And so that for me was a very good fit with the further developing and training I had before. So that's what kind of led me down this path.
I love that. I love all of that because my background, everything started with spirit, right? Everything's always got, it has to go back to spirit, and it's so easy to fall off of that, especially in the world when you're working and you're earning money and you're doing these things. It all wants to take us away from spirit, which is who we are at the core. And it's also what's missing. So I love that that was also your foundation, because you're a phenomenal human being, Robert.
Oh, thank
I
you.
mean,
Thank
I
you.
wish because you live in Spain now, it's harder for us to communicate time zone wise. But I wish I could sit down and have coffee with you. I'm gonna have to fly to Spain at some point so we can hang out.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to go over there too and meet you there.
I
Of
know.
course.
Come to Texas. Everything's bigger. All
Everything's
right.
bigger.
So they say. My waistline got bigger, but then I lost it. So, that's a whole other show. So let's get into your book, this new book, your masculine revolution book. First of all, can you define masculinity in today's society? Because I think it's a hot topic. I think it's a needed topic, but I think a lot of people don't understand it, or they have a misperception, a misunderstanding about it.
Yeah, I think most of when it comes to masculinity, a lot of us think of the traditional roles that society creates for us. And when I say society, I'm also including any type of tradition. It could be religious tradition, anything that really helps shape what is a role that's acceptable to social norms or society. And the way that I'm looking at masculinity, I'm looking at it through the lens of archetypes. And what I mean by that is I'm looking at it as an energy. And so it is an energy that shapes a pattern or way of being. And it's not necessarily tied to genetics or biology. So it's really more an energy that basically kind of envelops us and it helps us to behave in a certain way, make decisions in a certain way, have relationships in a certain way. So this is the way that I'm looking at the topic of masculinity. And then in the book, it's so important that right from the beginning, I lay that premise that masculinity is an energy. It's also used by both men men who are identifying as male and biologically they identify as male, as well as women. So this is kind of the gist of the book. And then I tie it into my personal story. So it's kind of interesting how it's kind of a blend between biography, if you will, as well as these Jungian concepts, which, like you mentioned, I think is a hot topic and it's very much needed today.
So where do you think it's needed, or why do you think it's needed the most as far as masculinity? Because I know there's been a lot in previous years about toxic masculinity, right? And that sort of authority archetype. And I don't know the labels for the archetypes you've used, but in the book specifically, but just it's been the lockdown, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And even as a woman, because sometimes my masculine energy as a type A personality, a doer and achiever, it will kick in, and I can look in my past and go, that was out of control, unconscious, toxic masculinity, right? Not going to say I never slipped there. Sometimes we all go unconscious and blind. But that being said, your book kind of shifts it into another direction that unlocks something for people, right? What is that?
Yeah, so it's really about how can you, and you did an excellent job describing that, how can you recognize that energy within you? And so, because I basically start the book from this idea, which is what most of us hold, which masculinity is related to men. And so, in the book, I do kind of start there, and I'm kind of stating that today, even men, young men, boys, the way that they're raised, a lot of the times they're raised to maybe negate their masculinity. Maybe they're being promoted to be more, go down more of a feminine route. So you have this idea, I know in the late 70s and 80s, you had this idea of men finding their inner feminine. You had that whole movement going on. And I think that that, in a way, was a reaction to what was happening at the time. So it's kind of the pendulum swinging the opposite way. And like with everything in nature, there has to kind of swing back, and we have to find a middle ground. So the book aims for that. And then on top of that, the book also addresses how does that fit in with even sexual orientation. So that's another level to that. But I do think that today, for example, we're very familiar with the some of the negative, or what I call the shadow side of the masculine archetype. So, for example, the tyrant energy.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of can sense that, especially in this day and age when we're looking at and feeling all these different authoritarian figures rising up all of a sudden. It's like, where do they come from? And they're there. So because they're there, what do we do with that energy? How do we look at that energy? How do we understand what's happening there? There's some positive aspects to the tyrant. And what I mean by that is, for example, when a tyrant's in charge, we don't have to worry about crime rates. We don't have to worry about being mugged in the street because everything's so under control. And it's interesting here in Spain, where I'm back and forth between Miami and northern Spain. In Spain, you ask sometimes an elderly person, and you say to them, "Oh, tell me about how Spain used to be," or they start talking about the good old days. And some of the things that they'll tell you is, "Oh, it was so safe then. Under Franco, we could, you could walk anywhere and you would never get mugged, and crime was so low." And, so they tell you all these positive things where they felt safe. But yet, psychologically speaking, under a tyrant, people don't mature. Psychologically, people stay as children, they stay infantilized. So they're looking at the head of the government or the head of the regime to take care of them and take care of all their needs. And that's just impossible for one person. to do.
Well, it's like
And
that with a
so,
parent who's that way, right?
yeah, exactly.
If you had a parent who was a tyrant, you become unable to make decisions. You become unable to think for yourself. And yeah, I don't have to do anything. But then life happens, right? And you're faced with these things and you're not prepared. So there's
And
that
you're not
flip side of it too, right? I think the whole world,
exactly.
we all kind of experienced that during the pandemic and the shutdown.
Yeah,
Is all of a sudden we're told across the globe, the entire globe at one time, stay home,
yeah.
stay home. And while a lot of people were like, oh, thank God, because, we don't want to die and get sick, the other side of that was incredibly challenging because people were stuck home. And while you're listening to the authoritarian sort of, I won't go there, the
Dictator
rules,
mandate the rules.
the rules that were put into place, you don't have, a lot of people didn't have that understanding of, okay, now I'm home, but what do I do?
Yeah.
So there is that split. Does the book cover stuff like that to help people kind of understand when they get into that weird mind split?
Yeah, the book goes into some of the even history moments or events dealing with authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, there's, the aspect of, oh, I feel safe now because I do get to stay at home. But then on the other hand, what do you do? So the whole the ideal side to this is that we want our children, going back to how you brought it to being a parent, we want our children to think for themselves, right? Because in the end, we're not going to be here forever. We can't always tell them what to do. So if they can get in touch with who they are, with their essence, and really trust themselves to make good decisions, because they've had a few years with us as parents and we've hopefully done a good job with them. Now it's their time to kind of live their lives and make those decisions and learn. A lot of the times, even a lot of adolescents and early adults, they're scared, they're terrified to make decisions because they don't know they're going to make the right one. So there's a lot of pressure to do that. But it's okay. Every decision is a good decision. And you can always
Mm-hmm.
change that decision when you see that it might not be so good. So it's this idea of how do you reconnect with your essence? And an element of this book is how do you connect with your essence, that is that masculine energy, because there's a lot of different types of energies flowing through us, but I'm focusing more on this masculine energy, and it comes in different shapes and different flavors, if you will. It's not just one thing or one size fits all, which is another I think myth or thing, something that has to be corrected, with only thinking that it's one thing, that masculinity looks this way and that's what it is. And my book kind of tries to throw that out the window, because it's really different things. And how can we recognize that and get in touch with it?
Well, I think we need both sides at different times, right? It's interesting because I could not sleep last night. Always when I have a morning thing, right? I can't sleep. So I was up till 4 and I used that time to journal, like to just, and I think I whipped out close to 50 pages in my journal. My hand was just so sore. And part of the conversation that I had, because I used my journal to talk to spirit, right? And to keep myself aligned. Part of the conversation I was having with spirit last night was how there's, because I very much am into archetypes as well. And I'm into the hero's journey, and a lot of my, like what I resonated to in my younger years was the tarot, like the major arcana in the tarot, how we cycle through. And if you really looked at it, they're just archetypes, and you move through them, whether you're male or female. You can
Mhm.
be the emperor, and sometimes you can be the nurturer and the empress, and sometimes you can be, you know, the magician. And then when they go upside down, it's the extreme of those energies in the negative. So it's always curious to me how we're constantly in this balancing act. But a
Yeah.
lot of people, I don't think, fully understand that balance of feminine and masculine, and that no matter what gender you are or identify with, you have both parts. You
Yeah.
have, and there's a reason, like everything in life, there's a equal balance that we need to get to, so we're not in one extreme or the other. So with the archetypes that you've used in the book to help people kind of understand where they are in their own journey and how to
Mhm.
shift to become better in relationships, better with their emotions, and because you teach leadership and EQ, how does this apply to people that are leaders in business, or even they're trying to work their way up? Because there's a lot of people trying to get promoted, and I know EQ is a big hot topic because the workforce now is saying all the stuff that I've been researching and writing on lately, haven't released it yet, but writing on lately has to do with this call from the workforce since the pandemic. We want you to care about us. We want you to have some humanity. We don't feel like you care about us. So it doesn't matter, what you want, unless we feel like you appreciate us, you're taking care of us, you're listening to us. And that's all stuff that it's EQ, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think a leader really has to get in tune with who they are. And because again, they're the same that we're talking about masculinity and different types of archetypes, there's also different ways of being a leader. And even when you study emotional intelligence, there's a coaching leader, there's an authentic type of leader, there's an innovative type leader. So there are different leaders. And in this book, we cover some of these archetypes. And it's interesting, just kind of going back a little bit. This book really it kind of was born when I was given another book as a present. So if I may, because I
Yeah.
know you like to hear the backstory. I was in an institute to be a Jungian analyst. That's where I was studying on and trained to be uh, an analyst under the Carl Jung theory. And so when I was on my way to Denver, and I kind of share a little bit about this in the book, I was given another book by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. And this book, which is called King, Warrior, Lover, Magician, and then later they ended up actually going deeper into the different archetypes. This book was a book that really changed the way that I looked at a lot of things. And so after I read this book and I was so touched by it, as part of the training to be a Jungian analyst, you have to come up with a myth. You have to come up with an archetypal plate. So there's different things that you have to do, and I'm probably sharing some secrets here on this podcast of what it is to study to be a Jungian analyst. However, for me, this was part of my thesis. So I was actually writing this originally as a thesis.
Hmm.
And that's why there's also this blend with my life story in relation to these men in my life who were significant, like my father, my stepfather, my uncle. And so I was writing all of this up as a thesis. Years later, I was introduced to an editor and in New York City, and she worked for a very large publishing house. And when she read this, she said, you got to make this into a book for a bigger audience, not just academia. And so she helped me. She was the first to really help me reshape this book and to what it is now. And I mentioned her at the beginning in my thank you, my dedication page. And so she's there as well. So, in other words, when you are looking at yourself and exploring who you are, you start to recognize these energies and you start to recognize these patterns of how you do things. And that's where you can kind of say, oh, yes, I do see that there's a warrior there, or I do see there might be a magician present, or a king trying to maintain those healthy boundaries. So, all of these things is really a way to express something that's coming up from the unconscious that we don't really know what it is, but we're starting to kind of give it shape and form. And that's where these archetypes come into play. So I always just like to kind of say that an archetype is really an energy. It's something that is coming up from within. It gives you a way of being, and it cuts through culture and gender and nationalities and everything. I mean, if you're human, you have these archetypes basically. And how do you recognize them? How do they work for you? And how do they work against you? And so that you could basically kind of channel yourself in a way that's more appropriate or that it will help you in a certain situation. So, very much like the zodiac, I would say as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting because as you're talking about that, I think about, well, how can you use the information that you learn in this book through the self-examination? And I think information alone is waste, right? If we don't use it and apply it to ourselves. I love work like this because we then can take this and look at those archetypes and go, all right, this is what's called for in this circumstance, which life changes, circumstance changes, who's in front of you changes. So what archetype do I need to bring to the table when we're faced with a problem? There's a conflict, right? Do I need to be more nurturing? Do I need to be more of the tyrant to take control and then shift? And I think the more we become aware of what those archetypes are, we get to choose, consciously choose, and then bring them into our way of expressing it. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. And I think that that's just the whole work. You've had experiences with the work that you do with your clients. In a Jungian analytic type setting, it's very similar. It's how can we make the unconscious conscious? And then once you have it conscious, what are you going to do with it? You got to do
Right.
something. And if you don't do anything with it, then it's going to, I don't want to say destroy you, but it's going to really make a lot of havoc in your life. So once it's conscious, it needs to be applied. So, like you said, you don't just simply learn about it, you really want to apply these concepts. And so, like you said, there might be a time where you might have to be a warrior. You might have to, work full steam, and that might mean not sleeping much. That might mean not eating much because you are on a deadline, you want to get this done, and you're fighting a cause. I mean, that's very warrior energy. Or you might have to learn how to have good boundaries. Maybe you're in a relationship that doesn't have good boundaries, or maybe if you're a leader, you let people walk all over you because you don't know how to hold people accountable. Then that requires more of a king type energy. And so again, these are just ways of kind of conceptualizing something that doesn't have a lot of shape or form. So we're kind of giving it some shape or form so that it has more meaning behind it. So I really liked how you said that just learning the stuff is not enough. I mean, you really have to apply to your life. And I think that that's why we're here on this planet, is to apply and to grow. And then as we're growing and applying, we are serving others. And I think that that's really our purpose here on earth, if you asked me.
Well, I was, again, back to my late night 50-page conversation with Spirit. One of the things that um, I was writing about and really reflecting on was because of, like, I'm shifting my messaging and I'm getting ready to release things in a very different way to a higher level. I don't know if I want to say higher level audience. It's to people who want a higher level of joy, a higher level of engagement, right? So there's a different language in there, and one of the things that came out of that which this is perfect timing for this talk, was we go through life experiencing the vast amount of personalities within us and emotions within us. And I mean, I'm one way, right? If I'm playing with the kids, if I'm playing with my granddaughter. But then we sit down for, I don't know if you know what Catan is. Have you played Catan?
Say that
That game,
again.
Catan.
Oh, Catan. No, I
Oh
don't
my
think I
gosh, you
know.
got to check it out. It's a fun game. It's a long game. We like to play some board games, and last year we got into this game Catan, and we bought all of the different ways you can set the board up. But it's funny because if we're playing Sorry, we're a lot more polite with one another, right? If we're playing Clue, we're even a lot more polite with each other. You break out Catan, and even my 11-year-old granddaughter becomes warrior like, right?
Wow.
It's because you're building pathways, you're building your empire and connect. So the first one that connects the biggest roads and builds the biggest kingdom, they win. And everybody's warrior comes out and the competition comes out, right? And there's a like a lot of games, there's a thing called the robber. So if you roll a 7, you lose a turn, or I don't remember what happens, but someone can place a robber on your place where you're getting resources. So you're not getting resources until that robber moves. So you kind of have to stick up for yourself. So it's an interesting thing. I always watch how everybody's interacting when we're playing these games, because I do love to dive into what's driving this emotion, what's driving that move. Because I think the human potential is so vast and infinite that we've just barely poked the surface. And it makes me think about that with the archetypes, even, because a lot of times, I'm not going to say always, because I can get very competitive, right? I'm a Sagittarius with an Aries rising. I'm all action, all fire. But when it comes to games and the kids are involved, then I pull on my moon, which is Pisces and more nurturing and more intuitive, right? Now, with my son-in-law, because he always blocks me, I have no problem always putting it on his square. But with my granddaughter, whom I love, right, and I want to encourage her, I will never do that to her. Isn't that
Wow.
funny? And so
Yeah.
I am pulling, even in a simple game, we're pulling on those archetypes. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I would say the game is pulling these archetypes from you. The game in this, and it's interesting because you're talking about this game, which I'm going to go check out. And my work with leaders at these companies is a very playful work. So as you're talking, I'm already thinking of new programs I could design maybe around Catan, because it sounds
It's a
like
6-hour game. It's a long
yeah,
game.
and no, and I think it's the game itself, it pulls on different aspects of leadership.
Yes.
Just hearing you, and it's amazing. I can't believe I haven't heard of this game before, but I'm gonna go check it out. But I think anything you have tools, let me not say anything, there are specific tools that we can use that will bring out these unconscious energies. You had already mentioned the tarot. It could be a very in-depth psychological session, like an analytical analysis, if you will, that will bring it out. You have this game apparently is bringing out these energies. And it's interesting because, as a Sagittarius, I just want to be, I'm going to venture out here and say this. Sagittarius is a warrior
Yes.
sign. I mean, the whole image of a Sagittarius with the arrow and the fire. So it's very much a warrior sign. So it's interesting how you were bringing up a lot of these warrior figures and elements, and you're a Sagittarius. So you probably have a birthday coming up
I
soon.
have my
Uh,
57th in
there you go.
Ooh, in less than 2 weeks. I'm a week.
I was going to say, yeah, it has to be
Yeah,
before the 21st or
on the
22nd.
18th. Yeah,
Yeah, there
7
you
days
go.
before Christmas. Yeah. But it's interesting, like Catan, because I think because you have to use strategy. To me, it's a
Yeah.
lot like chess. You have to plan your moves ahead of time. And then you have to decide, okay, what resources do I want? And how am I going to get those resources? And then who am I going to go around and who am I going to partner with? Because you actually do have to trade. And that's the cooperation piece. So it'd be perfect for corporate. As far as I'm concerned, leadership,
Oh,
perfect for corporate. Because there comes a point where sometimes your enemy, the person you're neck and neck with, now I have to trade resources because I'm not getting resources. And
yeah.
they want something I have, and I have to give them something, right? So it's I think it's an interesting game. Everybody loves it, down to my 11-year-old granddaughter. She loves the game. She gets
Wow.
frustrated because she still doesn't have that long-term strategy, right? But I have caught myself, and it does make me think, I guess, because I'm pretty introspective. I'm not everybody that plays Catan is thinking the way Bernadette and probably Robert's thinking, right? But I like watching the interplay, right? And it's that thing with leadership, same thing. There's some times when you're like, oh, and you fall back on your heels and you're no longer leaning in. And you're like, I'm not cooperating. And then you need resources. You need help. And you're like, ah, shit.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's where you can maybe turn into this tyrant. You could
Yeah.
have that tyrant energy, which is a tyrant, and I state this in the book, withholds the incoming and outgoing resources. And this takes me just to think of, even with our current events that's happening now, this whole issue with Gaza having resources or not, and having just one entry point and exit point through Egypt. And so even that can lend itself into, okay, what do I do here? How do I negotiate? And negotiating is very much tied to the magician energy. It's very much tied. And it's interesting, the book spends a good portion on the magician, simply because the magician, well, first of all, it's an archetype of the analyst or of a psychologist or anyone doing healing work. The magician energy is very much tied to that. And so, how does the magician transform things? How do they create something from one state to another state? And so it's very much needed, even in today's current event, as well as the other archetypes. So there's the whole idea of how do we protect our boundaries? How do we defend our nation? So there you're dealing more with the king archetypal energy. And so these are definitely concepts that we can look at in our behavior as individuals, but we can certainly look at them as, head of state with the different countries. How do the different countries handle this masculine archetypal energy? So that's another way
I think it'd be
of looking
great
at. So
for,
that's a little more macro level. Yeah.
I think it'd be great for teachers and schools. I mean, there's so many areas that it's like we see cracks. There's been so many structures and different um industries right now that are being challenged between the education system and the healthcare system and our military, and I mean globally, the foods, all these places, and the one thing they all have in common is human beings.
Yeah.
So we do
Yeah.
need to grow, we do need to understand these, and I mean, I think it would be fabulous in school for the teachers to really like understand what archetype you're operating in, and then shift if it's not working. Like you said, you made a difference in some of these kids' lives, which then changes how they show up in the world, and they're creating positivity. Like my favorite word right now, I've been really meditating on, is generative. How do we become more positively generative?
Yeah.
We're all creating, right? We are all the magician, as far as I'm concerned. We all are the magician. But are you creating positive, or are you creating negative? Are you generating good things in the world and leaving people with an imprint where they're like, I finally feel seen and heard, you
Yeah.
know? And of course, like one of my big things um, with working with entrepreneurs and leaders is become the leader everybody loves. You know, when we've got these statistics that say most people leave their jobs because their boss, they
Yeah.
didn't feel appreciated and they felt like they were tyrant and they were too authoritarian. You know, even if you've been that way, you can change it,
Yeah.
you can shift it, right? But it's not just about like be a leader, be someone that others love. It's they love you and they admire you and they follow you because you're authentic, because you're conscious, because you're
Yeah.
showing up and you're deciding what to bring to the table. So work like yours, this masculine revolution, to me, it should be recommended, required reading on that process of growth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's really about being good at shifting, like you
Yes.
said, and shifting to meet the demands of the current moment and situation. So, if the current moment requires you again to negotiate, you might want to look at the magician energy. If it requires you to set these boundaries or even to strategize, where are we going, create a vision. That's definitely part of the king energy. If it requires you to just fight for the common good, or we have to really, we're in a very competitive market and we have to get our products out there and we have to fight like hell to do that, then that requires more of the warrior energy. So it's really about how do we shift. And like you mentioned earlier, I am just focusing on masculine energy, masculine archetypal energy. Not There's a whole world of the feminine
Right.
as well. And that might be my next book, because I'm already looking at the dark feminine. That's something that really fascinates
We
me.
talked about
And
that a few years ago, right?
yeah, so that's and so that's it's interesting. There's I always have a lot that I have to kind of slow down and say, let me work on this first, and but yeah, it's how do we learn to be in touch with who we are so we can be authentic, as you mentioned, and then how do I learn to shift when I need to? And that requires flexibility, because if we're too rigid in any one, no matter how good it is, it's going to be problematic, because you could try to be the leader that everyone loves, and that's going to be problematic because it's impossible to get 100%. But if you could do the greatest good with the decisions that you make, the relationships that you build, the guidance that you give others as a leader, that's going to be probably the best course of action. And so that's something else to kind of look at.
But we
And
can't be and I want to clear that up too, right? Like it's one of the things I know as someone who is a leader who leads others. I strive to be the kind of leader when you have to challenge someone that
yeah,
they're not going to hate. So it isn't about people pleasing. Like I don't want people to get the wrong idea about that. Not everybody's going to like you. That's an impossibility. But if you love yourself, those people may not like you, but there is an aspect of their true nature, their true heart, that honors and loves you for it. Even if they hate you, but at least you can go to bed at night, right? And go, I was me and I brought my best. I brought my best. And I think that's important. But how do we do that? We bring our best when we're educated enough about what's available to pull on. So I love the fact that you have covered the archetypes, and it really goes into that place of, well, I get to choose. So I get to choose. I can recognize where I'm this, and then I get to choose over here. So I have a question for you. Pop quiz for Dr. Robert. if you wanted or needed, I guess should be a better way for me to frame this. And let me see if I want to get this right. If I'm in a position where I'm having to lead something and there's someone who's not being flexible, right? And maybe they've made some mistakes. What's the best archetype to pull for that in the book?
I would go right away to the magician because you're going to need to be a negotiator. You're going to have to transform some of that energy. And what's really interesting is there's a couple things here. If the other person is unconscious, let's just say that they're not fully aware of their behavior, then you can, move from your side and influence. And you could probably do that. If the other person is conscious, then you're going to basically kind of show them, look, this is your behavior. This is the effect it's having on me, on the team, on the department, and then see if they'll change. Not everybody will.
Right.
And so that's the other side of it. If people do not change, you have to hold them accountable. And one of the things that we teach our leaders is where to draw the line. Because again, it's, you're going to really try to win them over and get them to buy into your vision and buy into where you want them to go. But sometimes they won't. Sometimes they want to stay behind. Sometimes they want to jump ship or go somewhere else. And that is fine. That's an individual that you want to be free to let them go.
Right.
And I'm speaking, that could be in many different levels, both professionally and personally.
Right.
And so it's really about kind of you connect with them and you see where they are and then see if they'll be able to or willing to go where you would like them to go. And if they can't, you have another, you have many conversations, but then at the end, you have to make decisions. And when I talk about drawing the line, holding people accountable, then I'm talking now about the king energy.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, so the king is all about, this is where we draw the line. This is where I build the wall around my city. This is how I defend, my company, my department, my leadership. So all of those things come into play. So again, there's that shifting going on. You really try, but then, it's like a good coach. What does a good coach do? A good coach basically says, okay, this is where you said you wanted to be. Are you there? If you're not there, then what happened? And if, do you want to proceed? And I'll push you there. But if you don't, then you'll stay back and that's okay too. And we might not be able to work together because
Right.
I made a commitment to you to get you over here and you're not willing to do that. So these are some of the conversations that you have, but it really has to be coming from a place that you feel connected and comfortable with. If you're not comfortable being a warrior and that's what's needed, you might have to work on being a warrior. You might have to maybe build some of those skills up. If you're not comfortable being a king energy, then you'll have to work on those things. But a good leader has to shift between different types of energy. And again, I'm just only focusing on masculine energies.
Well, and I think as parents, as we are leaders, like I use that language leader because as a parent, I know my responsibility is to lead. And then of course, as someone who does a lot of video and runs courses and works with clients, I'm there to lead. I'm there to set an example. So I have one more pop quiz. For the leader that needs to be better at being humble and transparent and admitting when maybe the decision they made wasn't right and we need to pivot now, what's that energy?
That actually, we haven't even spoken about that. I would say that's more of a lover type of energy. We haven't really gone into the lover, and the lover is really all about being authentic and connected to others, having that relationship with others, winning them over. So, for example, your sales, people in sales, they're very much into connection and they just love, they get energy just from being around other people and having relationships with all these people. So, there's a lot of that lover archetypal energy there. And so, it's really about how can I communicate that I was wrong, and but at the same time kind of communicate how can we build up again our relationship, because usually if you've done something and you were wrong, that has affected the relationship in some way, whether there's a loss of trust, or maybe the person doesn't know where you come from or whatever. So it's really about how can we build up that relationship back up. So, and that requires more of that lover archetypal energy, that and it's interesting because for me that energy was very much manifested by my father. And so that's one of those chapters in the book that was very emotional for me to write, because my father had just that. I mean, he oozed that masculine energy, and oddly enough, my mother was very much a warrior, and
Yes.
so yeah, I mean, she was great at protecting her children. She was like that feisty hen that all the children are under her wings, and she'll bite you if you get close to those chicks. That's my mother. And my father, he just had a totally different energy. And with my father, he never corrected me. He never said anything that I remember that was harsh or disciplinary in any way. He also knew he had us for just one day a week. My parents were separated when I was very young. I don't remember living with my dad, but I do remember that every Sunday was my father's day. And so he would pick us up in the morning and take us back home at night. And I think because he knew he had such a brief time with us, he recognized that his job was to just connect with us, ask us how our school was, ask us about our lives. And it was all about connection with my dad. And so for me, that really presented me with this lover archetype energy.
I love that. I love that energy. I really do. I think that lover energy, not from the standpoint of romantic relationships, but from the standpoint of just that connection, that deep connection with others, is the new sexy.
Yeah.
It's what we all are really missing, and it brings so much fulfillment. Well, Robert, this has been amazing. I mean, I do think that all of the listeners would benefit from reading the book. What would you say is it makes the difference in your book, like how you present the information? And this is your original work. So, but how does it differ from, say, another archetype book or another Jungian book?
I think this book, I really opened myself up and really become vulnerable in this book. That's probably why it took me so long to get it out to the world. We're talking about almost 13 years, where I wrote the original thesis work and then getting it to where it is today. So I would say it's really about just connecting with whoever reads the book. And I'm sure a lot of people have had very similar experiences that I've had in their lives. And I'm just hoping that it's a way for them to have meaning attached to their experiences so that they can understand better of, oh, why this happened, or why did this person, this significant male figure, why did they treat me this way, or how can I learn from that experience? So that's, I think, is my hope, is that I basically became vulnerable so that people can hopefully benefit from me sharing at such a deep level. It's still, I admit, it's still a little scary when I think I'm going to have family possibly reading this book. So that kind of scares me. But and I just want to share this. My mom recently, about maybe 2 months ago, right before I was going to launch the book, she found out about the book and she asked me, why share so much? And I said to her, Mom, because I think there are many out there that need it. And so I think she understood, but it was difficult for her to kind of grasp that. And I don't know what's going to be her reaction when and if she reads the book. And
I'll
so,
tell you what, because I released my memoir in 2021,
yes.
and I didn't just release the paperback or the Kindle. I literally went into the studio and recorded it, right, in a professional studio. And my dad lives with me, and he's not great. His eyes get tired. So I gave him the audio version, and because he wanted to read it. And they're from the same generation of what goes on inside of this house stays in this house. He's
Yes.
a Marine Corps drill instructor. And I remember the day I walked past his room and he had it playing through the speakers of his computer. Mind you, he wears a hearing aid, so everything's super loud. And I hear my voice. And I'm at a part in the book where it was talking about him.
Wow.
Was the most like, and
Wow.
I walked past, I went outside, I let him just have his time with it, right? And I was expecting him, because he is so private, expecting him to come and ask me questions. And you know what he said in the end, Robert? I didn't know more than half of the things you experienced until I listened to the book.
Yeah.
And he didn't feel bad. And I was very careful, I think, with my language too, of sharing my story. I mean, this is my whole life, right?
Yeah.
And for the most part, I put all of it in there because these are the horrible things I had to get through, and then how I got through them and transformed. And it was very interesting because some of the things he took away from it was how resilient I was. And then he started to say, well, how come you and your brothers and sister, you guys have the same parents, but you act so differently? And I went, that's the thing with perception and consciousness, and the archetypes we choose, and are we aware of what they're like? It's a whole conversation. But once I heard him and he went through it, and I realized he wasn't hurt by it, because I think that's the biggest thing, right? We don't want to hurt our parents.
Yeah.
And my book
Exactly.
took 5 years to write, so I understand the 13 years. But I'll tell
Yeah.
you, just get used to it, because it doesn't matter. Someone will email me that I've never met before. I've not seen them on my social, whatever. Oh, I just read your book, and this one story really hit home. And at first I'm like, oh shoot, someone else knows about it, right? And I'm releasing it on the podcast for free, the audio version. So it's very interesting. But at this point, it's just never going to stop, Robert. Like that feeling of, oh, this is all of me out there. It actually I think it makes it easier because you got nothing to hide now.
Yeah, and I want to say that that person that told you of that specific story you shared, you touched them at such a deep level. So I just find that's miraculous.
Well,
I really,
sharing your story, though, that's the same thing, right?
yeah,
And weaving it into the how do we relate this topic of masculinity, these archetypes? You have to tell your personal story,
yeah,
right? So
yeah.
thank you for putting it out into the world. I mean, I just want to honor you for being brave enough
Thank
to
you.
not just put out an academic, here's the archetypes, go study them, use them for but actually weaving in your personal story. Because I mean, you know this, and I hope our listeners begin to understand this. Human beings learn best through story. We relate the best through story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well put.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you want to share about the book? And the link, it's called, I'm going to read it again. Masculine Revolution, a journey to reclaim your masculine essence through the power of archetypes. The author is Dr. Robert Hernandez. And I am going to have the link and all of that in the show notes so that you can go get a copy. But is there anything else that you wish we had talked about that's in the book that you're like, but they need to know about this?
I think just for them to be aware, anyone reading this book, is to understand that masculine energy or masculinity is tied to something much deeper, much bigger than just gender or biology. And that's one of the first quotes I have of Carl Jung in the book that everyone will get to see is just to kind of wrap your head around that because the rest of the book is based on that premise.
Okay, I have a question now because it just popped up. So I'm just going to ask a bonus question. I know this is a long interview, so thank you for being patient. Um, in the Western world and most of the world, we see God as a masculine figure, right? Why is it so much that we relate God to the because you have a theology background, right? I really want to see what you have to say about that because we do. We call it he.
Mhm. And when you say the West, it seems to me you're referring more to Judeo-Christian um, religion or spiritual
Yes.
beliefs.
Yes.
Yes. And so, again, with anything that has no shape or form, because um, no one has really seen God that we know of. People think they've seen God or they've experienced the divine. And again, all of that is something that has no shape or something that we can touch. And then, of course, in the Christian culture, we say that God became flesh, and that's kind of why we're celebrating the season of Advent, is because we finally have this thing we call God all of a sudden wrapped up in our humanness and full of blood and skin and all of that. And so it's interesting the whole idea of labeling God as he or attaching a masculine archetype is because we see God as a king, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or because we see God as our father and the father that will defend and protect us. But yet, if we look at, if you look at biblical tradition, especially in the Old Testament, in the Jewish culture, God also comes across as a hen who protects her kids, her little chicks under the wings. There's also a feminine spiritual figure that is also tied to the divine. So, excuse me, in all of that, we can see that God also changes and shifts, almost like a shifter into these different aspects. But at the end of the day, it's something that we have an experience of. It's something that we know is there. It's very much alive. Whatever this God looks like, or whatever we want this God to look like, and so I just think that because tradition has so many years and we have lived mostly in a patriarchal society, it's just easier that we just kind of affix this, okay, masculine, and we're going to call it he and all of that. But if we can move beyond that, even and kind of see God in all the different aspects of the divine, then that's going to help us not only find meaning to many different experiences that we have, it's going to bring us closer to this aspect of the divine. And so I think that is so important. And I'm finishing up another book, which will be hopefully ready in the next couple months, which talks about leadership, but bringing it back to this idea of the self. And
Mm-hmm.
the Carl Jung describes the self as a numinous divine figure within us. So I'm just going to leave that there. but I think it's kind of tied to the question that you have.
I love
And
that.
so hopefully this will be a little bit of a cliffhanger.
Yeah, and of course you're coming back when that one's ready to go, and any other time that you have something exciting to share. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and thanks for answering that bonus question. And I'll just add, like, it took me years to get to a place where I can say, and just because I came from Catholic background, Christian background, when I say in my prayers, Father, Mother, God, like I bring it both in, because to me that's more complete. Not for everybody. You believe the way that you want to believe. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. But for me, when I did that, it just, the richness of the experience of my perception of God completely opened up.
Oh, good for
Something
you.
about it. Yeah.
That's great.
So go check out Robert's book, get your copy. It's available on Amazon. And is there anywhere else that they can look for the book? Or if someone's a leader and they're like, I want to talk to this guy, what can he bring to the table? How can they get in touch with you?
The website will be dr period rb at influence.com. So the website's influence.com with an S and not a C. So drop the C after the N and add an S .com. And also they can find my book on my other website, which is discoveringmyself.com. And as soon as they go there, the book just pops up right in front of you. So that's another way that they could explore the book. And it would be great to connect with anyone that has questions or wants to take this to another level.
Yeah.
Yes,
And one
thank
thing
you.
I'm going to pop in there, because I am an author and I know how important this is. If you do read the book, go leave a review. Go leave a
No,
review,
I
because
haven't.
it helps generate, how often the book gets seen by other people on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I have not, but that's another one that sounds great too. You have a lot of resources, Bernadette. So
I
I appreciate you sharing all of that.
I love you, Robert. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Check out the book. Look in the description. If you have any questions, you don't know how to get a hold of him, even though it's there, you're welcome to just ping me and I'll direct you right there like I'm directing traffic. Have a great day. Summon your greatness. Make this the best day of your life. And then tomorrow, do even better.